Well, Heidi, thank you very much for doing this today. We really look forward to chatting about your documentary, Stranded Nation. So, to begin with, can you tell me a little bit about why you actually undertook this project?
Well, for me, it was really important as a New Brunswicker moving out to Alberta to really get the story straight. I found once I moved out here, I learned a lot about the oil and gas sector. And for me, to be perfectly honest, I knew nothing coming out here. I knew very, very little. I just knew that oil and gas was dirty. I was against it. I touched a little bit about that on the film. I don't go into great detail, but that certainly was my primary perspective on it. So once I moved out here and I began speaking with locals, getting a better understanding of the conversation, I started to feel a lot more passionate about the subject.
So, the idea, I guess, if I understand this correctly, is that people outside of Alberta and I suppose Saskatchewan don't know much about the oil and gas industry, have a lot of misconceptions. But the polling data shows that actually Canadians are pretty supportive of oil and gas, and 6 out of 10 British Columbians support construction of the Trans Mountain Expansion pipeline. Is what's the urgency to educate people about oil and gas if they already, most of them, support oil and gas?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what stats. I'm just using my own personal opinion. I'm not here as a big corporation. I'm certainly not here as a production company. This is literally the most organic piece of work I've ever done, ever undertaken in my entire life. So basically, my whole driven passion is for my own family. I'm really close with my folks back east and my grandparents as well. And I know my grandmother didn't know anything about oil and gas. And I certainly, over the years, I would come back and start chatting with it. And I started to realize that there was a need there. There definitely doesn't hurt to have that educational tool to just give out the basic elements of what's going on. So, for instance, they may support oil and gas, but they may not know what oil and gas does for their day-to-day lives and what petroleum byproducts are, what we use for steel manufacturing, what we use for all of these things that are in our society. So I wanted to put that connection a little bit stronger. So when we're talking about a pipeline project and we're talking about LNG, they know what LNG is and they can put an actual definition to it.
Right, but you've kind of inadvertently, then it sounds like, stumbled into a big national debate because the debate is between people who are Jason Markusoff in the Maclean's magazine article a couple of days ago called them petro patriots, and you, unfortunately, I guess maybe you might not like it, but I'm afraid you're going to get stuck in that category because almost all of the arguments that are in your documentary
Mm-hmm.
are associated with the Petro Patriots, the hardcore, boosters, guys like Cody Battershill, who's in your piece, Frank McKenna, the Modern Resources CEO, people like that, and that unfortunately, so you become part of the battleground,
Mm-hmm.
and the argument is, and I'm frankly going to make it in my column today, is that kind of hardline approach is actually not appreciated by Canadians. Canadians are more middle of the ground. It's a little bit of clean energy, a little bit of oil and gas. As long as we're in the middle, we're okay with that. So, what's your take on that?
Well, I personally, I'm really proud of the film and I'm really proud of the narrative that they put forth. I mean, that's certainly a perspective on that. And I do respect that because I think that's the whole point of democracy is to be able to have these open debates and these open narratives. They don't all have to be the same. And I think it's really about listening to each other. And I really do believe that they have been kind of hardballed and put into a back corner. And that's really what I'm proud about with the documentary is that presents one voice. I do understand going into this documentary world that it's not both sides, and I totally understand that. I knew that going into it. But if you look at narratives now in documentaries, certainly online and opinion piece, even in journalism, I'm sure you can speak to this as well, more than I can. There is usually one dominant narrative. And that's just the kind of the society we're living in. And even if you look at Leonardo DiCaprio's film, which is really what inspired me to kind of start looking into documentaries, is he doesn't show Alberta and the good parts of what they were doing up there. He just showed his own opinion and what he saw in a helicopter. So I thought, you know what, at the same time, this is a back and forth thing. And I do believe that in between that, there can be a collaboration and there can be a middle ground of policies that are going to spread from all of this conversation.
One of the things that struck me, because I just published a book about the Alberta oil sands called The New Alberta Advantage. And so I got the chance to interview some, Suncor, Cenovus executives. They weren't in there. And I was, because the oil sands is so dominant now in Alberta, it's 80% of Alberta's oil production. I
Mm.
thought I would probably maybe see a Mark Little or an Alex Pourbet or somebody like that. Did you try to get them into, just to be interviewed? And if not, what was their answer?
Well, I mean, I certainly tried to reach out to some of the bigger companies like TransCanada and Shell. Those were my first two ones as well, because they do have a lot of influence in the industry. I mean, but here's the reality. I mean, I was not a filmmaker. I had zero journalism experience. I basically, well, I'm not basically, I am a waitress at Joey Eau Claire. So my reach is not hard and it's not far. So I really was limited to who was going to be able to help me. But the people that I chose were the people I wanted as well, because I knew putting this together again, I wanted to create this very strong narrative moving forward. And there are a lot of points, whether you agree with them as or not, and if they're petroleum patriots, as you like to say, they really, really do create a very, very interesting perspective of what oil and gas is. And Chris definitely is not against renewables. And I really like that the film does not just focus on that. Does it go in depth into renewables? Absolutely not. I don't have a 2 hour long movie. And I think this is a conversation that you could write thousands of scripts on. You can put thousands of documentaries out because it's so complex and there's so many different layers to each part of the story. But this is my starting point, and I'm really proud that this was where I started, and this is where I can move forward from.
Well, look, kudos to you for what I like. It was coherent. It was well structured. Everybody was eloquent that you interviewed. The production values were really actually quite good. I was
Thank you.
impressed with the look of the piece. So, but let's get back to this debate and the ideas. And that's what I'm really interested in, is
Mm,
the ideas
yeah.
in your piece. And so part of the debate, and the reason I wrote my book, was because I argue that the oil sands are taking the carbon out of the barrel. They're decarbonizing, and they're lowering the carbon intensity of their heavy crude because they want to get into Asian markets in 5 or 10 years. Once we've got another, we get TMX built, and China puts carbon pricing on in their markets, that kind of stuff.
Mm.
And I think what I heard in your documentary was the voice of the old oil patch, the people who are defending the way it used to be, as opposed to the generation and the new oil patch, which is the oil sands folks, basically, who are headed in a different direction. What's your take on that?
Okay, well, I'd like to just clarify a little bit more about that, because you have a point specifically in the film that you're kind of referring to? Because to me, this is a really fascinating conversation. I think the old oil and gas ways are done. I really believe that. I think the people that do support that kind of old mentality, it's not going to last. We all know it's transitioning. We all know how fast this world is moving. And my point is not that. My point and the whole narrative behind it is that Canada is not dirty oil, and us buying it from somewhere else is really going to hurt everyday Canadians. And that this transition, excuse me, is a lot more complicated than what we're actually putting on paper. And I do believe that Chris really does a really good job at breaking that down into a little bit more simplistic way for people to get that. Because I mean, if we're talking about 2040 goals, or we're talking about Paris Agreement goals, what is old about that? Do you know what I mean? The old school ways wouldn't even be looking at that. And even then, that kind of, I can't speak to that because I'm not old, and I'm not in the oil and gas industry. I haven't been out here for 30 years. So
Sure.
I can't really speak as an expert from the transition from 30 years ago till now, but I can speak to the fact that it has changed. And what we're seeing now, maybe it's not changing enough for you, which is totally fair. That's a solution driven method. But I do believe that change can be achieved. It sometimes is a lot slower than what we anticipated, though. And my goal with the film is just to make sure that Canadians are on the one page, that pipelines need to be built, that Canada is not dirty oil, and then we can move on from there in the debate.
Well, let's talk about the pipeline issue, because you mentioned the fact that we do buy, Eastern Canada buys 600,000 barrels a day of imported oil. Now, 64% of that happens to come from the United States. So our buddies down in Texas that send up their shale oil, they do it at a low enough cost, probably we're not going to be able to displace them. So are you looking at that other 36%, that's the Saudis and the various other Middle Eastern and European producers? Is this message in part aimed at Eastern Canada and that issue?
I mean, I certainly think that's something that I hope creates a dialogue back east. I know a lot of people in my community, for example. I mean, if you say when you're filling up your gas tank, where does it come from? You know, and this is what I'm saying about stats: is that people may agree with it and they may support it, but is there that connection? Is there that factual connection when they're actually touching things and doing things in their day-to-day lives? And from my just personal experience, I have not seen that strong connection. And when I do say it's Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and the United States, they're like, oh, well, what about Canada? What about Alberta? You know what I mean? So that's really what I'm hoping. Again, I mean, I think like any journalist or any documentarian, you just hope to create dialogue. This is the whole purpose of making change, and I really do believe in that. And I know it sounds really, really naive, and maybe I am, but I appreciate how strong Alberta has been, and now that they're starting to gain a little bit more traction with their voice. Yes, do I believe, asking, Alberta to separate from Canada is not the way to go? That really upsets me, and I really do not like that dialogue. However, they are hurting out here, and we need to listen to that cross provincially. And I think if we accept that and we start building this pipeline, we start getting these things going, then you're going to start to see that retraction of that negativity kind of fall back a little bit more.
Okay, well, fair enough. That's a can of worms we'll leave for another day. And I'm going to make a prediction, and
Okay.
I'm going to predict that not many people are going to watch the documentary. And I know you don't want to hear that, but I think that's what's going to happen, and I'll tell you why. For many years that I've been covering this, and I worked in the industry for a little while, and which is, as you know, the industry is driven by engineers mostly, and then lawyers and accountants. And these are the people that always argue that Canadians need to understand better. Boy, if they just understood, if they just had more data, if they had more statistics, they would be on board more. And I don't think that's the issue. I think it's there's an emotional attachment, emotional
Oh,
component.
totally agree with that. Totally agree. There's nothing wrong with having an emotional component to it. But I think this is what's interesting is that, even when I'm promoting the documentary, I'm not shoving facts down people's throats. This is about everyday lives that are affected by this. This is about rural communities across Canada. And we're talking about all natural resource production. It's not just oil and gas that's being hit in question, it's everything. So I think this is, for me, a very personal story, and it's a very personal voice for me. And I certainly know that this affects a lot more middle class folks than what I would say even oil and gas really realizes, is that, again, we're talking about potash, we're talking about forestry, we're talking about our exports, everything, how we develop things, our lowering our carbon emissions across Canada is going to be a huge challenge, and what policies are going to be in place that are going to help people.
Heidi, thank you very much for this. It's a very pleasure to meet you, and we'll have you on again down the road after your documentary's been out for a little while. Thank you very much.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Bye.